Welcome to the Business of Esports podcast, where we explore the intersection of business and esports, the fastest growing entertainment phenomenon of this generation. Please welcome your hosts, Arda Okal, William Collis, and Paul Dawalibi. The Business of Esports podcast begins now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural edition of the Business of Esports podcast. This is the podcast where we dive into all the major topics surrounding the business of esports. Yes, it's a very self-explanatory podcast name. My name is Arda Okal. I will be your traffic cop. I will be directing the conversations through all the topics. And now the two gentlemen that you really want to hear from, I should say, is William Collis and Paul Dawalibi. And before we get started with the topics, gentlemen, let's talk about why people should listen to your opinions. William, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Perfect. Hey, so as Arda so insightfully said, I'm William Collis, and I have a valid perspective on esports because I've sort of lived the growth of it from the life of an entrepreneur. I co-founded Gamer Sensei, which is the world's largest esports coaching and education platform, and I'm also a co-owner of Team Genji, which is now ranked as the #1 Hearthstone team in the world.
Should mention that Paul is wearing a London Spitfire jersey.
I am.
Must be a big London Spitfire fan.
Not really, more of a bandwagoner. I like when teams win.
Did you buy that after they won the championship?
I did.
Okay, fair enough. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Paul.
Lifelong gamer. I've been playing games for, I guess, 30 years now, maybe more. And been an entrepreneur, been a venture capitalist, invested in a bunch of tech companies over the last decade or so. And started to realize with gaming taking off and esports taking off, I could marry passion and business together. And I think that's, in essence, what we're trying to do with this podcast here, right? Figure out and help people navigate business and esports and how those two things meet.
And if you can only see the room we're sitting in right now, you'd see how passionate he is, not only about technology, but about esports and streaming as well. Let's get right to it, gentlemen. There's a lot to talk about this week, particularly we are in the shadow of BlizzCon, of course. That will be happening, the Overwatch World Cup. Lots of announcements forthcoming regarding Overwatch and the Season 2 of Overwatch League. Paul, let's talk about that just a little bit. You were a big Overwatch fan, maybe a little bit less now, but let's talk about the interest for Season 2, the increase for the number of teams. Nate Nanzer has come out and said that 28 seems to be the sweet spot in terms of number of teams he'd like to see in the league. From a business perspective, though, how have you noticed the growth of the league, and do you think that this will continue to steamroll in the way that it has?
Look, when I heard initially when Overwatch League was first announced, and I heard that the buy-in for new teams was $20 million, I think was the number.
Yeah.
My view at the time was there's no way these guys are going to make their money back. I just couldn't see a team in year one making that kind of money in a new league, not a new game, but a new league and a new format, a new way of presenting esports to the world. And I was proven wrong. All of the data points to that these teams made money and the league made money. But with the expansion of the league, my fear is I know fewer and fewer people that I know, especially, and I think the numbers confirm this, are playing Overwatch. I think the player base is in decline. I know there's a lot of complaining around the game. I think the bigger question here is, if fewer people are playing the game, does that mean people will still watch the game? And can you separate those two things? I love watching Overwatch. I hate playing Overwatch today. And
Why?
I just don't think the game is fun to play anymore for a lot of reasons. I think the skill gap doesn't exist. It's become too easy to play,
okay.
and that creates frustration. But I love watching it. I love watching it played at the highest level when you have coordinated attacks and teams that are communicating. That's fun to watch. And for those reasons, I think Overwatch League Season 2 will be successful. The question is how long if the player base is in decline.
See, it's so interesting because I'm sort of the opposite of you then, Paul, because I actually really like to play Overwatch right now, probably because it's a more casual FPS for me. And so the more accessible skill curve helps me jump in and not feel like an idiot. But I can't stand to watch the game right now because the action itself is so frenetic. And you're essentially still effectively locked 90% of the time to the view of the players, which means you're jumping and skipping around the map. I mean, look, I've been a gamer my whole life, and I get a headache watching the Overwatch League. So,
But what about the new with the Overwatch World Cup semifinals and finals? There will be new camera angles. Basically, you can be your own director in a way to get multiple different views. That might necessarily help the frenetic pace of the traditional broadcast we've seen.
I mean, I certainly hope so, and I certainly think that's Blizzard's. Look, I'm not the only person to have said the Overwatch League or Overwatch in general is difficult to follow as a competitive sport. I think that's why Blizzard developed the tool, because it was the most common piece of feedback they heard about how to improve the viewing experience. I think it remains to be seen, and I think fundamentally, Overwatch was a game designed to be a great FPS first. And with viewership, I think the intent of it being a viewership-driven sport shoehorned in more towards the end of its life. And I think the reality of that is just mechanics and gameplay around the heroes are designed in such a way that there is frenetic motion. There is a lot of skipping and sudden movement. I mean, the classic example is the titular, is that the right word? The Overwatch, the emblematic character of the Overwatch League, Tracer, teleports. She skips and jumps through time. There's no way to make that a good viewer
Tracer's
experience.
not in the meta right now.
This
So
is
if you're a
not-
Tracer main, you are not happy.
Fair. But
You know where I've heard that
yeah.
argument before, though, William, is ice hockey. Right? When ice hockey was trying to make sort of big inroads from a viewership perspective in the US, they said, you know what? Americans can't follow the game. It's too fast. It's too complicated. Let's put a big glowing light around the puck.
Yes.
And to me, I think if you play the game and you understand the game, initially it may seem, frenetic and too difficult to watch. But I think anyone who watches enough ice hockey doesn't need blinking sort of halos around the puck to be able to follow the game. I think that comes with time.
I would say this, though. That technology would absolutely work on a broadcast in 2018. It did not work on a broadcast in the 90s. But I think now we're far enough along that we could make it undeniable part of the broadcast.
So what's the esports equivalent of the halo around the puck?
I believe that once we get the different views, I think, expand on this, William. I think that tell us what bothers you so much about watching a broadcast right now and what angles you actually want to see.
I actually want to in answering that question, I want to rewind to what Paul said, because I think it's important. He said, if you play the game, look, if you play Overwatch, right, it's not so hard to follow because you'll understand the mechanics behind the characters. You'll understand that McCree has his role and Genji has his dash and Tracer can jump 3 times, right? Like, you'll understand these fundamentals. So erratic character or sudden character movement won't be confusing. But the problem there is you have to have played the game, right? And therein lies the challenge that I think esports has as a whole in sort of crossing over in viewership is it's not intuitive like baseball or soccer or basketball, where as part of our just primary school education, we're forced to understand the core tenets of the game, right? Unless I buy it, download it, and spend 5 hours getting comfortable with it, I'll never have that sort of core intuitive gameplay understanding to decode the broadcast. And that's why I think, your comment about, well, it's less fun to play as a hardcore gamer, that's the real concern, because if the game isn't fun to play, you're going to have a smaller, familiar player base, right? That's going to degrade the viewership in the long term. And I think, that's the thing we can't forget about this is fundamentally, unlike traditional sports, the vast majority of people who watch the games also play the games, right? Like, I watch baseball. I haven't played baseball in like 10 years.
The hardcore fan base usually consists of, say, 10% of the overall available audience for a game. Do you think that these extra camera angles will really bring in a casual audience to say, wow, I actually do enjoy watching this?
Look, for me, the experience going to the grand finals was a unique one because I brought my wife, and my wife's not a gamer, doesn't play Overwatch, has never played Overwatch, has never even watched me play Overwatch. And she enjoyed that experience so much, she's asking if she can go back next year, right? Like, she loved it. She adored her experience there. And part of it is the presentation. I think that's where Overwatch League has really succeeded. The presentation has been slick. They've got great commentators. They've got good production value. The grand finals, were in a great venue. It was all very high level kind of production. And that helps to create entertainment that people will enjoy. But she didn't understand what was going on all the time. I don't think that took away from the experience that significantly that's the thing that kills Overwatch League. I don't know if a different angle or camera control is going to what makes or breaks Overwatch League, I guess is the point. I think there are other factors that play a much bigger role in what makes or breaks Overwatch League.
Do you have any on top of your head?
Again, the player base and the dedication of the player base. To just, if the costs of running a team spiral out of control, the business case may fall apart, right? If this year the buy-in is 40 million, I don't know, next year they bring 5 new teams at 50 million, 60 million. At some point, unlike traditional sports, esports tend to age, right? Today it's Overwatch, tomorrow it could be some other game. And so what is the longevity of Overwatch? That worries me more in terms of the viability of Overwatch League.
Let's end this topic on this. Obviously, we have this is a different model. This is the traditional sports model, having cities represented. We are still playing in one location right now, but the plan is to go city to city. This is a global league, and Blizzard has come out and said we want this to be a global league. Now, from a financial perspective, from a profitability perspective, what scenario do you see that model when Overwatch becomes we are playing home games, we are playing away games? What model do you see in which this actually could generate money for people who are investing?
The beauty of what Overwatch League is doing is they're leveraging a model that's familiar. What esports is really lacking today from a business perspective is buy-in from the traditional sponsor base that won't blink an eye to go sponsor Major League Baseball or the NHL or NFL, but esports seems foreign to them. What Overwatch League is doing is, I think, making esports seem familiar and comfortable. And if they can leverage that to get a large base of more traditional sponsors, that's to me where they win.
I also think first of all, I think it's incredibly clever what the Overwatch, I think probably the smartest thing they did was tying it to regions. But I think it's more than just the familiarity for sponsors and marketers. I think it's also defensibility for the teams themselves, right? Because now, as part of being, say, the Boston Uprising or the London Spitfire, they have carved out a set of marketing rights and sponsorship rights that are exclusively owned by that team. That's an incredibly powerful carrot to incent investment from large organizations like the Kraft Group. The other piece of it is, look, in esports today, and you kind of said this yourself, you're a London Spitfire fan because they won, right? Well, I'm a Boston Red Sox fan. They happen to have won this year, right? But I'm a Red Sox fan because I grew up in Boston. And I think
you're not going to become a Yankees fan if they win the World Series.
But that's my point. I think they're smart because they're giving you another reason to associate loyalty to a team other than victory.
Yeah.
And that's so key right now because it's changing it from what has been sort of a winner-take-all market for a few top teams to the diverse ecosystem you need to support a system.
It's way easier to support London Spitfire than Team Dignitas.
But exactly. And you see that in college sports in a big way. It's so much more obvious. Like half the people who watch college football have never been to that college, didn't attend that college, but they happen to live near it, or their dad went there, or like it's a way to connect to something. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and in a future podcast, we have to talk about college esports because I think in many ways the next step is for that league, that regional leaguification to take place at the university level. Because just like the market is open for the professional scene, it's also open for the student athletes in a big way.
That'll be a topic for another podcast. Let's move on. Before we move on from Blizzard, any predictions for the Overwatch World Cup? Who's taking it all? Team USA? Any chance at all?
No.
None.
I don't think anyone can beat the Koreans.
You're just riding the South Korea train. No chance.
No.
What about my Canadians? Any luck at all? They
I'm
have
a big
the benefit of
XQC
not
fan.
facing South Korea before the finals.
Barring somebody like spiking drinks and cutting mouse cords, I'm sorry, there's no way. And you see that in the makeup of the teams today, right? Like almost every successful team is either entirely Korean or anchored by top Korean players. The market dynamics are such that the best players come from that country. Those guys have to win.
So we have two major topics that we're going to get to in a little bit. One of them is, are esports really sports? And also we're going to talk about Twitch and competition in that streaming market. But first, let's get to a couple of other news items. Let's talk shooter wars. So Epic, the creators of Fortnite, raised $1.2 billion for Fortnite and future projects. Meanwhile, competitors in the same space are not doing so well. Black Ops 4 essentially has only received $500 million in sales. Activision stock is down 9%. Battlefield pre-orders are down 85%, and EA shares are 11% down. So the question is this a testament to Fortnite being so strong or competitors not being strong enough?
That's a really good. So I think we should contextualize. First of all, like only $500 million for Activision. I mean, these games are still hugely successful, but the reality
not
is
as successful as Fortnite.
Yeah. The reality is like there's a Fortnite effect right now. It is sucking the air out of the room from other first-person titles. I mean, even the Overwatch League, I think, as successful as it's been, it launched in a pre-Fortnite vacuum, and it's going to be really interesting to see now that Epic has announced, what was it, $200 million in dedicated esports investment that's going to come to market, I think, starting next year effectively. It's going to be interesting to see what happens there versus the league. But look, I think the important thing is Epic did the smart thing. They have a hugely successful title, and they've now monetized it in a massive venture raise, and $1 billion can make a lot of things happen. It can incent and build out an ecosystem that can sustain what I think to some degree was a flash in the pan title that moved quickly to mimic PUBG's success and did it well, to its credit, but it was mimicry with Fortnite a little bit. They've now cemented a financial advantage that I think they can turn into an ecosystemic advantage. So I am so long on Fortnite. I think it's here to stay. I think like get your skins now, kids, because you'll be showing them to your grandchildren. I mean, I'm quite serious. I think it's a new genre. It's changing the way people engage in FPS by making a more democratized skill cap. And they now have the money to guarantee that they can hold on to this lead for the foreseeable future.
Look, I'm just going to come out and say it. I hate Fortnite as a game.
To play it or to watch?
To play it. I just don't like playing it.
Okay. Why? Just not a fan of that genre? Or?
I like the Battle Royale genre. I'm not a fan of the cartoonish sort of version of it.
Okay, fair.
And I think the building, while it's an interesting angle, takes away from the shooter aspect that I love so much. What's interesting with Fortnite is it a question, is their success really because of the game, or is it more the business model? And to me, where they were successful was the business model. Not that business model is that new, but they took it arguably to the next level. And I think where the game has staying power is based on that business model, not necessarily based on the game.
So dive into the business model.
Where they've been really successful is make it free to play, right? Give it to everybody so anyone can play it. The buying Call of Duty costs $60, $70 these days. That's a big barrier to get into a game. Versus Fortnite, you can play it for free. And charging just for cosmetics like Fortnite does not only motivates Epic to keep creating cosmetics and keep content fresh and new, but it keeps players coming back.
But they did other things that are clever too. And I think you're absolutely right. Being the first Battle Royale game to be free to play was super smart. But I would say there were two other things that really anchored their success. One is, I just have to be upfront, it seems minor, but it's a big deal, the art style. Prior to Fortnite, all the Battle Royale games were ultra real. I mean, it was essentially PUBG. I say all the Battle Royale games, but it was basically one. But it was ultra realistic, and that cuts you out effectively of the 13 plus demographic. And I think the art style positioned it to be a more accessible, slightly more kid-friendly game, and that allowed it to get an edge and build share. I think you can understand that. I can understate that. I think the other thing about Fortnite, though, that's really important to note, and I think this is probably why it bugs you so much, is it's designed, and again, I mean, this is my own opinion, but I think I'm right here. It's designed to be a lower skill cap game, right? Battle Royale as a whole is lower skill cap because you can be flanked, you can be shot from the distance. There's a lot more randomness in the game. It's not the pure skill of CSGO. And Fortnite in particular, by introducing these building mechanics and your whole defensive base, fundamentally, I think it's actually removing the core shooter skills that you love and building an emphasis on simpler, more pre-planned actions. And guess what? That's great for the mass appeal of a title. And it's great for people who aren't in the top 1% and want to feel what it's like to luck into a win, or want to be able to execute, some pre-planned builds and have a decent shot at winning regardless of how bad their aim is. And I think the democratization of skill that Fortnite brought is a big part of how it was able to draw such a big user base so fast.
But how will that translate to top-level esports? How will Fortnite take over as the popularity is there, but what about the top-level competitors? At the end of the day, you need the best players playing the game.
Yeah, but I think this is a case where you're right, a lot of the times these sort of mass play demographic titles don't have the core gameplay skeleton to support a competitive scene. I think in this case, the shooter mechanics are solid enough, okay, and there's now enough money behind the dev. they can expand the title's competitive play to make it rewarding for an esports scene. I think the logical thing you already see happening is teams in Fortnite. It's not just a battle royale mode. You can now queue up with your buddies. And straight away there, you're introducing team dynamics and, the possibility for randomness to be mitigated because you might die, but you still have 2 squad mates who are alive, right? So that's the first step. I think with $1 billion, you're going to see many more steps. And you might even see, I don't think it's crazy to see a bifurcation of the title where there is a competitive mode that's played by esports players that is different from the core mass market battle royale mode that most gamers choose to interact with.
Paul, you're shaking your head over there.
With Fortnite, the player base is big enough to sustain an esports scene. Will the pro players be, without a doubt, the best players in the world? I think that's harder to say in a game like Fortnite. It's not as clear cut because there is an element of randomness and because I think the skill cap is not there. But will it be entertaining? Will a lot of people watch? Yes. Because there's a huge player base, right?
Everyone. There's also an issue though with the fact that the most popular Fortnite player in the world may not necessarily be the best Fortnite.
He's
player
not.
In the world.
I don't think he is.
But that's the thing. Now there's this conflating of 2 different things in your mind. Fortnite fans may just want Ninja to be the best Fortnite player in the world, and now if he loses a series of games competitively, if he chooses to join this league or whatever might happen, then there might be a letdown.
I think if he's smart, he won't join the league. But because he's going to make more money as a
probably make more money as
streamer,
a streamer, right? Yeah.
Right. But I think that's a problem with any esport in its infancy, which is, are the people playing it at the highest levels there because they really are the highest level, or are they there just because they were the most popular at the beginning?
Let's dive into that, since this is the Business of Esports podcast. If Ninja were to be a competitive player, how much money would he lose potentially? Like being a competitive esports player versus the amount of money that he's bringing in as a streamer.
Meaning if he just stops streaming altogether?
Yeah, let's say he just goes to competitive esports, just to give people an idea of the type of money that a streamer like himself would be making versus a competitive
I would say
player.
At least 1, maybe 2 orders of magnitude cut in what he's making.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I wish I could remember.
10 or 100 times less.
So the streaming is much more lucrative financially.
At his level, far more lucrative.
I think he earns, what, $1 million in subs a month? Is that the figure? That it's
I think
1 or 2 million?
He's at about 100,000 subs right now, maybe a little bit less than 100,000 subs. Figure he's making about $3.50 per month on every sub. So just on his subscriptions, he's making anywhere between 300 and 350,000, let's say.
That's just on subscriptions
Just on
alone.
subscriptions from Twitch, right?
So,
then you got to add in sponsorships. You got to add in everything else he's doing from a business perspective, including all of his social, right? If he does a sponsored post on his Instagram that has 1 million followers, there's value there. He's making money there. Running ads on Twitch, he makes money as a partner. So my sense is he's easily making about $500,000 a month today just on Twitch,
and
just
then,
as a streamer.
To put that into context, so let's just look at, I think, the most established esports league, the Overwatch League today. The salary there for a top player starts at $100,000. It can go a little bit higher, but most of the salaries anchor around that price point. So I think that sort of answers the question. Is you can get $500,000 profit a month or $100,000 a year. That starts to get at the differential he loses by swapping over from full-time streaming to full-time competing. Now, granted, that's very simplistic because it assumes he doesn't get sponsorships or other things along with the competition, but it shows you today the money in esports from a personality side is on content production. It's not on tournaments and it's not on winning.
So one question I will ask as we move along from Fortnite, do you think that this infusion of funds into Epic and their investment into their esports league, do you think that will change that? Will we see higher salaries for these players to make it more of an incentive to play Fortnite at the highest level? No longer will it be $100,000 a year.
I think the winnings will increase, right? The prizes will increase. The tournament pools will increase. But I think the streaming angle is still such a major revenue generating avenue for some of these guys that if they have the audience there, I think it will be a long time before playing professionally will equal the salary there.
Yeah, I also just don't think it's particularly in the interest of either the publishers or the teams to pay a significantly higher wage. I mean, let's just be blunt and Machiavellian about it, right? Like, after the point where pro players are earning enough to be able to devote themselves to the title full time and to have it be a reasonable reward for somebody who's committed themselves, like it's just cash out of another organization into an individual's hands. So there will be a movement upwards in player salaries for sure in esports, but it's going to come from the players themselves. It's going to come from unionization and representation by like CAA and UTA and people like that. That's what's going to drive the salaries up. It's not going to be the publishers or the teams.
Look, if I was Epic today and I raised $1.2 billion, I'd set in a plan in motion where in 6 to 12 months, I actually kill Fortnite and I launch Fortnite 2. Like I'd be building Fortnite 2 today. And I would get around this idea that a game has a limited lifespan by leveraging the current success, leveraging all the dollars they raised, and literally just iterating on new games every couple of years.
That is so interesting, though, because that sort of flies in the face of what success is looked like in game. I mean, if you look at, I would say, the two marquee titles in games for longevity and success. World of Warcraft, not an esport, but I think it's safe. That was sort of in many ways. They tried. And in many ways, World of Warcraft has a lot of similarities with network effects and things. And it was the singularity point at which, I think a gaming culture awakened online. And League of Legends, right?
I would throw Counter-Strike in there.
Sure. Add Counter-Strike to the mix. All of those games have built about never sequel ever. Extend the, look at, wow, that engine is fraying on the edges. That game just looks so dated when you load it up. And, you're telling me Activision Blizzard doesn't have the money to invest in WoW too. I think the model has been, because players incur such high fixed costs on these games, both in terms of time to skill up and digital inventories that they've amassed with real money. Mm-hmm. The model from publishers has been to reap that commitment by extending title longevity as long as possible. And I don't see that changing. What I do see happening with Fortnite, and if Epic is really smart, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, we have an FPS play. What's the first-person shooter for people who don't know? The shitty games with guns. I should watch my vocabulary here. Where can we take the Fortnite brand that's a complementary play style? Can we do a collectible card game? Can we do a massive online battle arena, a MOBA like League of Legends? Can we do a fighting game? And I would be looking at moving my player base to complementary titles that won't cannibalize the main title, but will insulate me from that gradual decay and flight that I think you're worried about.
With all due respect, I don't think the 13-year-old playing Fortnite on his cell phone is going to care about a collectible card game. Yeah, but that 13-year-old playing on his phone is a fickle consumer, and that's what I worry about, right? The next shiny thing will come along, and they'll be playing that, which is why if I'm Epic, I'd be iterating fast. If I understand who's sustaining me, because I think it is that younger gamer playing mobile, playing on console, to me, they have to fly in the face of the traditional models that have worked before. And they did it successfully with Fortnite, right? By making it free to play. Why not fly in the face of every other aspect of the model and be iterating on the game, launching new games? I don't think they can survive on one map with the kind of player they have today forever.
So not disagreeing, but then, so I'm Epic. What's my competitive advantage versus Riot Games when Riot Games launches their Battle Royale title? And by the way, this is not news. I don't think that's in development. This is a pure hypothetical for those who are listening.
Because every developer is creating a competitive game right now.
Yeah, it could very well be in the cards. I'm just trying to say, I take your point, Paul, and I think it's a good point that particularly Fortnite is indexed young, and you have a consumer. I think the industry term is tourism, right? People enjoy playing titles for 2 to 3 months. They get bored and they're on to the next ice cream flavor. But what's your sustained advantage? Is it just the capital you have? Is it the mailing list, of users you've built? Because those don't feel as bedrock advantages to me as the time it's taken to skill up in a game, the collection of skins I have, and the commitment I have to the community, the streamers I like, the blogs I read. Like, those are the things that hold me in a title. And again, I think that's why, in my mind, the right play is lean in. Yes, you're at risk. Yes, the consumers might migrate. But at the end of the day, you have a huge lead in building not just a game, but a lifestyle that your competitors don't have. And I think of it as a lifestyle perspective and lean into that, if that makes any sense.
Any thoughts?
God help us, Fortnite lifestyle.
You joke, but that's, those are the memes. That's people doing Fortnite dances at their proms. And this is the what is it? The Visa tweet.
And even real sports teams saying no Fortnite on road trips. Can't bring your can't bring your can't play any format.
I think it's a bit of a flash in the pan. I think it is.
Okay.
I don't know if it has the staying power, because I think they're iterating on the cosmetics, but I don't know if they're iterating on the game enough.
But I think here, and this is important, I think this is an interesting difference of opinion to tease out. I think your problem with it is fundamentally you don't think Fortnite is a good game. And so therefore you don't see it being able to sustain itself, because fundamentally you can trick people into playing something that's not that fun for 3 months, but you can't trick them into playing something that's not that fun for forever.
But
is that
the Battle Royale mode, interestingly enough, hides those shortcomings. I think it's not a great game, but because every round of Fortnite is different, it hides the fact that it's not that interesting of a game
Will it
at
make
its
it fun
core.
esport though? That style. Will we ever see Fortnite become the biggest esport in the world?
I think it will have a very large audience. Will it be the most competitive with sort of the greatest esport athletes?
Yes.
I don't think so. But it will definitely get the most attention and be paying out the biggest prizes, because that's the nature of its audience.
Simply because of its popularity.
That's it. It carries a lot of weight.
Yeah. But see, this is where I kind of put my stake in the ground, and I just think esports are bigger than the actual game themselves, right? It's the spectator experience, as we kind of touched on with Overwatch League. It's the community of content that's produced around it, the personalities. It's, like your own fond memories with the title. And I think when you get to a scale like Fortnite, and you get so many content creators and so many influencers and so much of the ecosystem, like Doritos chips, bending around the title, I think you get hard to displace in a way that makes up for the weak game, just very bluntly. And that's kind of a sad view in some sense. But look, this is where I put my cards on the table. I don't think, don't get mad at me, guys. I don't think baseball's that good of a sport. I think it's sort of a boring sport. People stand on a plate, they wait to hit something.
We've been talking a lot of baseball in this podcast.
Yeah, it's probably because I was watching the World Series. But I don't think that's the definitive sport of all time, right? If you were going to put me in a room and say sports are new, design the best sport you can, I don't think I would design baseball. But baseball has entered the psyche. It has such a support infrastructure, such a community, the memories of father-son ball games, right? That makes baseball bigger than the sum of its rule set. And I think, I hate to say it, I think Fortnite is kind of there. I think it's transcended its shallow but cosmetically passable gameplay, and it's entered a state where it's large enough to sustain itself on the things around the game and not just the game itself.
I have a feeling that this topic, particularly as we see the esports ecosystem around Fortnite grow, will be a continual topic of conversation on this podcast. Let's get some quick thoughts on the two remaining, maybe one and one, just for these last two short news notes. Rejected teams. So teams, well-established esports teams like Splice and H2K were declined from the EULCS in League of Legends, both teams fielding historically high-performing rosters. This is not the first time this has happened, but this is very high profile. We did see Dignitas being declined from the North American LCS in 2017. So what happens when established teams like this are rejected? Do they have a path forward without marquee games like this?
I mean, there's a path forward. I'll say this, as a team owner, it's literally your worst nightmare. You're banned from the sport that you're making your name in, and I think it's twofold, right? I think one is it highlights the power of publishers in this ecosystem. So is this being a business podcast, the thing you need to realize is, look, if the NBA decided that it wanted to ban the existing franchise teams from playing basketball, well, they could ban them from the NBA, but those guys could start a parallel competitive basketball league. That cannot happen in esports. If you get banned from League of Legends by Riot, there's not really a League of Legends off-brand you can go and play. You know what I mean? You're out. And so it's terrifying. And I think it highlights not only the power the publishers have, but increasingly their willingness to use it. I mean, these Splice and H2K were foundational brands. They were in early. They built and invested in the ecosystem around League of Legends, and their reward is getting kicked out and denied an application for, in many cases, I think what we're going to see is newcomers to the space, maybe more traditional sports franchisers that bring, a different type and a deeper pockets, maybe. But that's really scary. That shows you that as big as the dollar signs in esports are today, the market is still forming. And in particular, the publishers are very much in control of how it forms.
Really quickly, why did they get kicked out?
I don't want to speculate, particularly because I know a lot of the guys at Splice, but I suspect it has to do with the desire on Riot's part to mimic the Overwatch League in terms of deeply pocketed teams that can sustain and invest for the long term. And I suspect, and again, this is total suspicion, I don't have any inside knowledge, I suspect there were other applications that came from deeper pocketed capital partners that gave Riot a longer term view for those teams.
So Paul, it's just money talk?
My view is that long term, I think that dynamic will change a little bit. So I totally agree that in the moment it's sort of not the death knell, but it's definitely a big problem for those teams. But in the long term, and I think this happened in traditional sports as well, where over time, in the beginning, leagues had a lot of power, but over time, as players became more known, teams became more known, built followings, built loyalties, that power dynamic eventually will shift or at least balance itself out a little bit. If you have a team that has such a large following, the publishers will have very little reason to deny them. And so it absolutely is a question of money talks, money, influence, audience, all those things.
Last topic before we get to our longer form main topics, esports education. So we have some universities around the world that are announcing VR esports as an addition to varsity programs. This is very interesting. A New England college launched an esports gaming program led by Gears of War pro, Tyrell Appleton. VR esports, though, in general, is this for real? Is this where we are going? You are shaking your head, William, and I want to know why.
I think Paul's shaking his head too, right?
I think VR esports are ridiculous because I think VR gaming is somewhat ridiculous. To me, it's a novelty. It's something you do for a little bit. You show your friend. You think it's really cool. Until VR can introduce some amount of mobility, which is such a long way off, I think that it's not likely to happen in the anytime near future. It's just not that fun to play and definitely not that fun to watch. And so I think this is like, as a VC, I used to see decks all the time, and entrepreneurs were clever. They would put whatever flavor of the day in that deck to try and get my attention. Like today, there's 10,000 AI companies in the world, all claiming they do something AI. I think this is just kind of, it gets news.
VR is the new flavor of the month.
Yeah, it's not even that new, but it's new in the esports world to be talking about that in a legitimate way.
Yeah, I'm entirely with Paul here. I think VR itself just isn't a thing. It hasn't panned out to be what it was marketed as. So VR esports, and remember, esports they're another layer of complexity and precision across gaming, right? They're like the level up from regular single player experiences. We haven't solved the interface for regular VR gaming, let alone building new interfaces that have mobility and more tactile, make it more realistic and play better with the immersion of the viewability you get from VR. We don't have those, so VR esports is just not even close. And so I think it's cute that somebody did a headline grab by having VR esports, but I think anybody in the industry would know that's a total joke.
And I think Oculus just acts like their second generation Rift, and so that's not even coming to market. My view is this is dead in the water. So,
well, I will say I did play Tetris Effect in VR, and it was fun.
Well, there you go.
That's my contribution to this topic.
Occasionally, there are decent VR games, like what is it, Bridge Commander, the Star Trek sim.
It's fun for 20 minutes, and it's fun to show someone for 20 minutes, and then that's it. You're done with it.
There you go. That I think is the perfect postmortem on VR.
Yeah.
It's fun for 20 minutes.
And since the postmortem on you guys agreeing on a topic as we move on, so let's go to our main topic here: the sport of kings, esports being considered a sport. This is a long-standing conversation and debate among traditionalists, endemics, non-endemics. Are esports really sports? What attributes are shared between athletes and pro gamers? Where can esports grow? One of the big topics, I'm sure it's been around for a long time, but we hear it more and more now as esports continues to grow, is esports should be in the Olympics. It should be an Olympic sport. Let's see it on the grandest stage of athletic competition as the Olympics have been known to be. So where do we land on that topic of esports being in the same category? Paul, we'll start with you, as sports.
I mean, I totally agree it should be an Olympic sport because that's really my last shot here. But I don't think I've got a shot at anything else.
It's all our last
That's all I've
shots.
got left. Every time you have a game like, I've heard this argument with darts or billiards or other sports that don't require a ton of physical ability, that they start to question, is this really a legitimate sport? And I think if you define sport so narrowly as something that requires a lot of muscle or a lot of sort of cardiovascular fitness to play, then no, it's not a sport. But I think that's too narrow of a definition. My view is anytime you have something competitive between human beings, you've got sport. And therefore, pro gamers are most definitely athletes. Where I draw the line personally is now I'm starting to see a lot of these like I think it was an Engadget or a Verge kind of YouTube video where they went to go visit one of these esports training centers.
Okay.
You know, where they have nutritionists and they're making them sort of, they're training them as if they're elite football players. And there I laugh a little bit because, you know, maybe one day that will be the difference between the number one guy and the number two guy. But today, you know, I also see 300-pound guys playing Counter-Strike that are the best in the world.
To be fair, have you seen the diets of some of these players?
Terrible.
Like, we talked about Doritos earlier. That was like an exclusive. That and Mountain Dew was basically the exclusive diet for esports players for how many years?
No, but to me, that's where exactly the point where I draw the line. Like, let's not overcompensate and try and convince the world that we're athletes here by building training centers and, you know, running drills and all that kind of thing. Let's be who we are, which is pro gamers.
William, is this a generational thing? I feel like if you ask anybody under the age of 25, they're going to automatically say, of course they're athletes. I consider them athletes because I care about them and I'm putting them into the category of athlete.
I very bluntly, yes, I do. And I think that's really astute, Arda. I do think it's generational. You know, I think part of the reason why we elevate sports on a plateau is not because of the games themselves, but because of the figures who play them, right? We view them as titans, influencers, people to look up to, right? It is absolutely true that the generation growing up today is not idolizing Michael Jordan, they're idolizing Ninja, right?
How many people alive today know Michael Jordan simply from a meme?
What is it, the crying one?
Right. He's just a dude that cries on the internet.
Yeah.
How many people alive today know him simply as that and nothing else?
Yeah,
Probably most Fortnite players.
Yeah, it's 100% actually. If you do the
Which
Venn
is a
diagram,
shame,
there's
but
total
that's a whole
overlap.
other topic.
But yeah, so I do think it's generational. And I think, in fact, by the way, it's a bigger trend in esports that a lot of the perception is generational here, right? Like, I think the people who grow up with it appreciate and understand how skill intensive these games are, how rewarding the mastery curves are, and, you know, the rich thrill of competing on a team digitally. And I don't think it is a leap to ask a 12-year-old, hey, look, is, you know, Overwatch a sport? They'll say yes, because to them it's ticking all the same mental attributes that they would associate with basketball or football or anything else. So yeah, it is generational, but to some extent, it's also sort of missing maybe a more interesting question that's underneath it, which is, why did in the past we anchor competition to the physical? Why did we think that was an essential attribute? And very bluntly, it's because we weren't able to simulate, you know, at the time where computing power was in like the 1980s, right? The simulations we were able to create just weren't rich and detailed and vibrant enough to support meaningful human competition and interactivity. And so that's why we thought sports had to be physical, because you could not build a digital sport. Now we've crossed that divide. You can have team dynamics and strategy and tactics in really deep and meaningful ways, alongside deep fighter pilot reflexes and, you know, all that stuff. You can have that in a game. So of course now this new category is being created for people who are growing up with it, but it doesn't exist for the older generation.
I mean, William, here's a question then. Is chess a sport?
Oh, I love that you asked that, because
right?
this
like if our definition is as broad as we're making it to try and include esports in that sport kind of category, is chess a sport?
Here's to generalize that. Can you call somebody who's using their mental capacity exclusively an athlete?
True.
Does athlete refer to physical and mental, and must there be a percentage breakdown in order to call them an athlete?
Yeah. So I mean, it's such an interesting question. So I think, and you can even ask that another way. Look, if chess had just been developed recently, if chess was purely digital, would we be talking about chess as like the second?
And look, I'll make the I'll muddy the water even more, and I'll be a real hypocrite here. I think mobile gamers and console gamers are not athletes. They're not playing sports to me. That's not an esport. That's not a sport. PC Master Race. To me, mouse and keyboard is the only way to play a game at the highest level and take advantage of those reflexes and mental ability and all that. Sitting with a tablet, I don't know how you're testing anything. To me, it's barely competitive. And so it barely meets my own definition.
Yeah, put aside the PC Master Race thing for a second, just going back to the chess question, right? Here's how I feel about it very bluntly. I feel uncomfortable calling chess a sport, right? It doesn't sit right to me. But I think if you reason it out, if you are rational about it and you talk about what do we care about, meaningful competitive interactions between humans that are dynamic and surprising, it checks those boxes. And that's my definition for a sport today. And so as strange as it is, because it's on the extreme end of a slope, so it's testing and it is uncomfortable, I think it is a sport. And I think, by the way, people had this debate in the 70s and 60s, and it was, controversial then, and people didn't settle it. So I think in some sense that's even more support for what I'm saying, because certainly it's gotten more plausible that chess is a sport with the rise of digital competition.
Here's what I will give to you guys. The definition of sport, according to the dictionary, it is a noun. Duh. An activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. So my question actually is it time to update that definition?
I like that question, but let's say we follow this very strictly.
Then chess is not a sport. There's no physical exertion in chess.
Well, how do you define exertion, right? If I move a piece, that's physical exertion, not much of it.
Yeah, I have to hit those chess clocks really quickly.
But this is where the definition is debatable.
There's no percentage of physical exertion here. Let's assume.
Do you have to sweat?
Right. Let's assume 50%.
Right.
But I get what you're saying. You're saying there is a minor amount of exertion, but the overall 99% of it is the mental.
I'll give you the example that I think is most convincing to me for esports being a sport, and that's, look, shooting is in the Olympics, right? And we don't seem to have a problem with it. We think shooting should be an Olympic sport. There's not a huge amount of controversy to get this thing out of there, right? How is shooting at a static target different from aiming with a mouse in Counter-Strike?
As a very keen Olympic skeet shooter, you can sweat skeet shooting. It's definitely very physically demanding. And it requires a level of physical ability that far outstrips even the most crazy Counter-Strike match.
But push back here, right? When you play Counter-Strike, doesn't your heart rate get elevated if you're in an intense match? Aren't you? I mean, look,
not due to physical exertion. That's more due to stress and anxiety.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But guys, so by the way, I can think like equestrians, for example. There doesn't tend to be a lot of sweat in top equestrian play or top equestrian gaming.
I don't know. Those helmets are pretty hot.
Yeah, I've had this discussion with other people, and one of my friends actually suggested that we redefine sport, and his definition actually would exclude esports, maybe. But his view was that if you can't get injured, it's not a sport. To be a sport, injury has to be a possibility.
That's interesting, but I can blow that up with a simple thought exercise, which is, what if we're in an Ender's Game world where you can plug into a virtual universe, and now I play virtual football? I mean, I'm just saying, like,
and I guess pro gamers have carpal tunnel and those kinds of issues.
The rabbit hole here is deep, and if your line in the sand is, I have to sweat, fine, that could be your line in the sand. That feels like a pretty weak line in the sand for me, and I prefer to take a higher road for this, which is sport exists because humans like to compete. We like to measure excellence. It's a tool for measuring human excellence. Esports can measure human excellence. So can chess, so can football, so can skeet shooting. It all belongs to the same category.
Perhaps this will be a generational discussion, in the sense that in 20 years, people will look back and say, how did we not consider esports a sport? But simply because there are more human beings on Earth that grew up with esports always being a thing. and being familiar to them and being their most important valued form of entertainment, which then you would then, as a human being, place more importance upon.
Look, in some ways, a sport, qualifying a sport is a popularity contest, right? That's what's interesting here. And chess, we brought up chess. Chess never made it into the Olympics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we could argue it's because some very smart people got around the table and decided very subjectively chess was not a sport because it didn't meet this criteria. But more likely, I think it didn't make it to the Olympics because no one cares to watch people playing chess.
There's also a lot of sports that get kicked out of the Olympics too, that are clearly sports. Like wasn't there a whole thing about amateur wrestling? Oh, it's going to be it might be out of the Olympics in 2024 or whatever.
So if Fortnite is as big, it gets bigger and esports take off in an even bigger way than they already have, maybe just the mass appeal, the popularity contest will get esports into the Olympics.
And by the way, bringing it back full circle to business of esports, therein sort of is the secret for why trying to focus on whether or not esports needs to meet a strict definition of athleticism or not is sort of missing the point, right? When you sponsor a baseball team or a football team, or you buy a jersey of a pro athlete, you're not buying it because the guy sweated more than somebody else, right? You're buying it because of the audience, the access, and the prestige that's built into that, the brand equity, right? Esports has all those things today. So sort of regardless of whether or not we technically call it a sport or we call it pro gamer, which maybe is a good way to go. I don't know. There's certainly pros and cons there. From a business perspective, it doesn't matter because the audience size is dwarfing traditional sports. And so you better treat it like a traditional sport because it's going to activate and drive your business in all the same ways, and in some ways more effectively because it's a larger audience and a more cost-effective group to access today.
One thing I will add is I've noticed between the NHL and the NBA, one of the big prevalent thoughts, particularly among the highest levels, is less and less young people are watching these sports. So by creating an esports league or an esports tournament, it's almost acting as a gateway for these younger audiences to enjoy the esports component, but then perhaps be inspired to now watch the actual sport. So it's almost like a two-step process.
I hate that because it's selling the esports short. I'd never want esports to be the gateway drug to quote unquote a real sport, because
it should be its own sustainable.
Because I would much rather watch Overwatch League than a basketball game. Okay. But I think that's an attempt by those leagues to try and just take advantage of the upswell in the market. My extreme viewpoint of the industry of esports as a business is in 20 years from now, I think it will dwarf traditional sports. Traditional sports will be not a footnote, but much smaller than they are today, dollar-wise and audience-wise, than esports. And so if you believe that thesis, this is them attempting to piggyback on someone else that's about to pass them.
So let's talk about that. Let's fast forward 20 years. Esports, or electronic gaming sports, is the biggest thing on earth. Dwarfs all other sports. Their leagues are bigger than every other traditional sport around combined. Now, this conversation does it not now seem a little moot, in the sense that the reason we're talking about it is because sports have so much dollars behind it and it's so ingrained. But now in a situation where esports becomes the largest thing, it's almost like they can dictate the rules.
I think we're having our pro gamers, real athletes conversation because it's somewhat insecurity on people in the esports industry, right? Who want to feel legitimate, who don't want to be looked down on by traditional sports. So it's, hey, no, I'm a real athlete too. Don't look down on me. But I think that's ego more than anything. 20 years from now, no one's going to care whether we called pro gamers real athletes or not.
Actually, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's really astute. It's like you want to borrow the trappings of that celebrity. You can't, like, if I say to somebody, I'm a pro gamer, right? It probably conjures the image of me unfit, hunched over my keyboard in my basement. It's not desirable. Right. But an athlete, I get that. I want to be that. That conjures images of celebrity, of, popularity. And so you're probably right that to some extent it is insecurity. We want that title as gamers because we're trying to legitimize what we're building to a more mainstream culture. And that's the word we know that reflects the idolization and the excitement we have for esports.
I have to be able to tell my wife I'm training, not I'm playing.
Oh, me too.
That's a good way to frame it, yeah. So my segue to the next topic is one other realm that esports really seems to not necessarily benefit from, but really enjoy the fruits of is traditional television, right? Like when ESPN or when TBS is involved with esports, it's almost like a prestige because it is established, exactly like you said, William. But realistically, the overwhelming largest numbers come from Twitch or come from online platforms. And that's where we're going right now with our last main topic of this podcast is just the sheer dominance of Twitch in the gaming streaming market. And yes, there are other entities that are trying to get into this, whether it's individual streamers or streaming esports competitions, Facebook, Disney, Tencent, Google, etc. There are even a Microsoft with Mixer and Caffeine. There are multiple options there, but Twitch still seems to be the number one source. So let's dive into that. Let's talk about that infrastructure, that landscape right now, and could we see a disruption in the near future? Paul, start with you.
Look, if you look at business sort of very broadly and generally, it's very rare where the dominant player stays the dominant player forever. The world, business tends to find a way, scrappy startups tend to find a way to displace established players all the time. So I don't think any position is unbeatable. I don't think Twitch can't be brought down. But I think for the foreseeable future, Twitch has an audience today that is far bigger than everyone else. And they have all of the mind share. Now, let me put that in context. That's really North America. In Asia, it's very different, and the audiences there are actually far bigger than the North American audiences. But in North America, Twitch has all the mind share. And so I think for the foreseeable future, they will be very tough to bring down. My view is where they're vulnerable is they're somewhat prisoner to the characters, to the personalities who stream on Twitch. I watch Shroud. All the time I have his stream on. Twitch is on because I love watching him, love watching his gameplay. If Shroud moved to another platform, I don't think I would stay on Twitch. I would go to where Shroud was streaming because I'm there to watch him. And I think that's where they're most vulnerable. And that's where it's unclear how they defend that.
Yeah, I think I'm in very strong agreement there. And just I think for people who aren't familiar with the ecosystem around streaming, it might be worth giving some points of light to the listeners so they understand what it looks like. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the state of streaming today and then use that as a window into my opinion. So the winner today, Twitch, is Paul and Arda said, has the vast share of mind share. It's owned by Amazon. You have the next competitor for Twitch is probably, would you say, Facebook with FB.GG and the integration directly
YouTube
through
Gaming, probably.
Maybe YouTube Gaming, yeah. So you have YouTube Gaming, which is obviously owned by Google. And then you have Facebook, which is making a big play to the space. There's dedicated streaming built into all the Blizzard titles now to your Facebook page. They have FB.GG. And then there's these startup competitors like Caffeine, which just got funding from, I think, Fox. And then to a certain extent, Mixer, which is acquired and integrated directly with Microsoft and their ecosystem. And so that shows you two things, right? One is it shows you, hey, 3 years ago it was just Twitch. Now all of a sudden the space is crowded. Two, who is this space crowded with? It's crowded with really scary, powerful companies. I would think Amazon could win against pretty much anybody else, any other company stacked up. They're just innovative, they're smart, except now you have Google and Facebook fighting against them. Those guys are pretty smart. They're pretty wealthy too. So I think you're going to see massive money and technical expertise pour into the space. And they're fighting over, as you said, Paul, resources, these streamers that own the loyalty. You don't, as a viewer, you don't have the loyalty to the Twitch platform. You have the loyalty to Shroud. So you'll move with them. Money and technical infrastructure can incent those guys to swap platforms. I think we're heading to a world where Twitch is about to tumble. I just have to be honest. I don't think it's going to happen right away. I think they will fight very hard and very well. They have an incumbent advantage. They will stay a major player. But I think 3 years from now, gone will be the day of this single company, Twitch, having total mind share over streaming.
The other side of the argument, though, is why has no one toppled YouTube, for example? Not YouTube Gaming, YouTube proper. the YouTube experience is not that good, and it's getting worse. Have you tried watching a YouTube video? You're stuck clicking through skipping ads every 2 seconds. The experience is not that good, yet no one has even touched them in terms of dominance in the online video space. Why is that? And the reason is that's where all the eyeballs are. And for even the personalities on Twitch, that's the scary part. If I'm Shroud, what I would lose sleep at night, I think, is if I move platforms, what happens to my audience? Do I lose the eyeballs? So I don't switch. There's friction there because I want to stay where I'm comfortable and where the eyeballs are.
So that would be my follow-up to you is, let's say I am Shroud. Let's say I am an established streamer and I have a really substantial fan base that maybe a percentage of them will follow me. But now I'm on the biggest platforms, but now I have this exclusive deal in front of me that takes me to a much smaller, a startup stream, but it's a substantial amount of money. Let's say it's a 2-year deal or whatever, right? What streamer, from the company perspective, what streamer, or how many of these streamers would it take for them to really put a dent in the establishment and really disrupt the space? Is it going to take one ninja? Is it going to take maybe a sports rights? Like what is it going to take for a disruption to really occur?
The fact that Twitch is owned by Amazon, I think, makes it even more scary. So to answer your question, if I'm a startup platform and I'm trying to pull guys away from Twitch, what worries me is I could make an offer to Shroud, but Twitch has got deep pockets. They could lose money for the next 10 years. It won't make a dent in Amazon's bottom line, right? So they could pay streamers more to keep them. They could pay all kinds of incentives, pay them a higher portion of the subscription revenue, right? They could lose money for the next 10 years if their vision is to be the dominant player long term. And that's, I think, what's scariest for the players trying to challenge Twitch is Twitch has the eyeballs and they have the deep pockets that they can lose money for a long time to keep the eyeballs.
Yeah, but play that out, because this is why, again, I would say normally anybody against Amazon you would lose for this exact reason, except let's look at this from, say, Facebook's perspective. So I'm a social network. I am hemorrhaging young users, right? Everybody knows that's a problem right now for Facebook. I have esports and, say, Fortnite, which is indexing in my most vulnerable and most prime demographic. Am I not going to spend hand over fist to try to make a dent and to capture that mind share and capture those users back on my platform? And can Facebook not go toe-to-toe with Amazon for spending? So I think it's closer than you think. And the other thing is the competitive dynamic you said. So play it out. So I go to Shroud, and I'm Facebook. I go to Shroud. I make an offer. Shroud uses that offer to get a better deal from Twitch.
Yep.
Okay, well, guess what? Now Twitch is paying Shroud more, and I'm Facebook. I still have all my money. I didn't pay $1 to Shroud. I just jacked the cost up for Shroud for Amazon. So now I go to the next streamer, the number 2 guy. I make that same offer. Say he rejects it too and stays with Twitch. The cost gets jacked up. I still have all my money. You see where this is going. At a certain point, it's inflating the cost of the streamers. It's inhibiting Twitch's profitability. And at some point, I'm going to be able to get somebody. So maybe the market share looks like 60% Twitch, 30% Facebook. I don't know. But to me, logic would suggest there's going to be significant inroads made by these competitors.
I just don't think the competitors can pluck one guy and make a dent. If Facebook goes and gets Shroud, yeah, Twitch loses a little bit, but I don't think people are going to spend most of their day on Facebook because they got one streamer. And so while Facebook might be able to go toe-to-toe with Amazon in terms of spending, frankly, I don't think anyone can outspend Amazon today. And Amazon has a history of losing money in categories, namely like diapers and toys, where they lost money season after season purely to dominate the space. And once they've dominated it, that's when they start generating cash.
Yeah. So 2 things. One is my example. I mean, obviously it's scaled, right? It's not, this is not Facebook going one streamer at a time. This is a concerted program where they're poaching categories of streamers and specific titles. I'm not sure I buy your spending point. Certainly Amazon has shown more willingness than most companies to run in the red to get a category dominance. But I think if you're somebody like Facebook and this is a lifeline for your future users, you might be pretty incented too. But I also want to put a different spin on it. Let's talk about international streaming platforms, right? Because we're very focused on the US. But I do think there's a whole nother existential threat here, which is Chinese streaming platforms, and in particular Tencent. They own a controlling share in Riot Games, which has League of Legends, the largest esport by many measures. They're not a player in the North American or really the European streaming market. But let's say they wanted to promote, I think it's Dalio, is that their streaming platform? I can't remember. Let's say they want to promote it in North America. Isn't an easy thing for them to do a sports rights deal, as you alluded to, Arda, and pull League into their platform? And wouldn't that cause a mass migration of users? So I'm not saying that will happen. There are a lot of competitive forces that might prevent that, but I'm saying that's another titanic existential threat on Twitch's dominance. And I think these just stack up, right? At a certain point, you can't take all comers, you know?
Do you think we'll ever see, like, the other thing of this is, and you make a very good point regarding the sports leagues, right? Like with that, there are the top sports leagues, but with esports, you have the developers. So let's say I'm YouTube and I go to Blizzard and I say, I want to make a billions dollar deal where we are your exclusive home for your leagues, but also somehow your streamers. I don't know. I'm thinking way outside the box here, but could you not envision a world where some sort of arrangement exists where YouTube is the home of Blizzard, the home of Overwatch?
Well,
the
Twitch
home
did
of
that.
World of Warcraft.
Twitch did it with Overwatch League. That was the official
For Overwatch League, but
Right.
even more so is everybody that streams Overwatch. To be
that's
able
that's
to
a
say
level of control. I don't know if they'd be able to, because streaming
that permission does not exist right now. That restriction doesn't exist right now. But could that ever happen with billions of dollars on the line? Is that what it would take for suddenly a Caffeine, or maybe that's too small of an idea, but or a Tencent or a Disney to say this is how we're going to leave a dent?
You know, that's really a traditional sports view of the world. The same way if I want to watch, I'm so not up on traditional sports, but like if I want to watch baseball, it's only on this network.
Like as a broadcaster, I can't stream the game and talk about the game on Twitch. That's illegal because I don't have the rights to show the game. Right. But I can play the video game, right? There's no rights fee for me to stream playing a video game. But is that day coming, or will some sort of deal cause that to occur?
That has sort of happened in that I think there have been some tournaments like the International for Dota where they didn't let streamers stream the tournament on their own streams and comment over it.
Yeah, and the most high-profile example is Nintendo. For a long time, Nintendo just didn't let you stream.
I think
their
they
games.
still don't, right? You have to sign up as a creator
monetize
or something.
You can't monetize.
Yeah, you can't monetize
certain
it.
rules. Yeah,
that's it.
But that's one example. I guess what I'm trying to get at more generally is that could be one example that might be far-fetched, but that could be a way that one company could dent Twitch. But how else could that possibly happen?
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, it's actually not as far-fetched. Do you think? I mean, if you look at Blizzard, they sort of did do that. I mean, just Twitch happened to buy that deal, but they did do that. They packaged the broadcasting rights for their league and they shipped it out to the highest bidder.
Sure. Imagine a world where like Disney buys an Activision Blizzard, right?
I think
then decides they want to put everything Activision Blizzard on their new Disney streaming platform.
Yeah, which, by the way, I think is extremely likely to happen. They have a streaming platform right now. It's best in class. It's waiting to get activated. Disney's not dumb. They see the esports. So again, I think it's likely to happen. But I think also, Arda, to your point earlier, I think there are even more subtle threats rather than just a straight out rights buyout. Like, for example, what say YouTube, YouTube has creator tools now. What say YouTube said, we are going to preferentially promote, and to some degree they already do this, preferentially promote people who are streaming with us, will preferentially promote their video content. Now, all of a sudden, I'm forcing existing content creators with large networks to stream, and I'm incenting streamers who have residual revenues on YouTube to be on the YouTube platform. That's not hard for them to do, and that's going to create one pull factor that might lure people over to Google's side. And that's just one example of a strategic business decision a company can make to, drive a chink in Twitch's armor.
Any thoughts, Paul?
The Disney owning the game and the platform is probably, like, that scenario, I think, is the only one that really threatens a Twitch. Like, I think it's your scenario, Arda, where it's like, if the platforms start owning the games and controlling basically where things can be shown, that's scary for Twitch. I think that's where I lose sleep, because no amount of money can really beat that, unless Amazon starts and goes on a buying spree for like game publishers and things like that. But
they have their sort of timber lumberyard, right? They're Amazon. I mean,
and they're trying to deliver games through Twitch now.
I could just imagine, right? Like, Nintendo's a good example. But that's across all platforms. But like Disney, total hypothetical. Disney buys Blizzard. Disney then says, we have this streaming service where this will be the only place that you can watch all of Blizzard's esports leagues, and any high-profile or low-profile streamer can only stream on this platform.
Yep.
No Twitch, no YouTube, no Caffeine, etc. Only the Disney streaming platform. And everywhere else will be a copyright rights violation, and we will flag them, and they cannot be monetized or whatever. So then suddenly, within a day, every single giant streamer of those games will be moving to the Disney product.
And just to support, because I think you're saying that's far-fetched. I'm saying it's unlikely, but it's not that far-fetched given, look, Disney has bought most other IPs that appeal to, a boys, 9 through 14 demographic. World of Warcraft seems a pretty good thing to add to that. And it's certainly within an acquisition size Disney could manage, A. But B, they've just shown they're willing to gate their content with Netflix. They're yanking all of their videos off of Netflix. So to me, it's almost, if you think Disney will acquire a game publisher for the IPs and the lifestyle, which I think is unlikely, but it could happen, in some sense, then it's almost a foregone conclusion that they're going to be gating the content because they've shown the desire to fully own that ecosystem. And if they can force Netflix out, I guarantee you they can force Twitch out.
The only other approach I think I've seen to people trying to beat Twitch, so there's this conglomerate, sort of vertically integrated approach that you could anticipate maybe the Disneys of the world will go after. But the other approach is, how do we make it frictionless for people to stream and get people on our platform? And I think that's where Steam is going, right? There's rumors around Steam having a streaming platform. If I have Steam running and I'm playing my game on Steam and I just have to click one button and I'm already streaming, that's a lot easier today than streaming on Twitch, which it's not hard, but still requires a decent amount of know-how and setup to get it working. That approach may work. The question there becomes, does it help to have 10 million more people streaming if they have no viewers?
That's a great idea. I'm playing Overwatch, and then suddenly one of the options is, hey, I can watch Overwatch streamers in the game.
Well, you guys,
I could just flip who's live right now. It's like it's their own network of streamers or content in the actual game itself.
Just to be clear, there is one-click streaming from Blizzard games to Facebook right now. That exists.
Yep.
So again, not that far-fetched. And I think what we're talking about is localized content. The bet for a lot of social media sites is, for some, like Instagram, you want to track the celebrities and see what the best people are doing. But for others, like to some extent Facebook, you want to track your aunt. You want to track your friends. You want to compare. And I think the localized streaming market, where it's you watching your friends stream and seeing how much better or worse you are, or seeing their sick plays and comparing it to your sick plays, doesn't exist yet, and might be larger potentially, or at least comparable in market size to the celebrity-driven market. So again, this is in my mind, none of these things by themselves individually is likely to knock down Twitch, but the aggregate forces arraying against them are so large, right? I just have to see them as vulnerable.
I mean, there's one third approach, which is, does Twitch become too diversified that it loses credibility as a game streaming site, right? Like when you have 20,000 people streaming themselves, like doing art or ASMR or some other nonsense, is that really esports gaming streaming in the sort of pure sense? And do more hardcore gamers like me or others get turned off and go, you know what?
Do you?
I mean, I don't, because it's easy enough to avoid. But I think if the problem became bigger, if we start seeing more and more of this and the gamers become a real minority, I mean, I'm already a little bit bothered that ASMR streamers are way bigger than some of the game streamers, even the very talented ones.
By the way, for our listeners, if you don't know what ASMR is, you should look that up. That's the homework for today's podcast.
But I respect the fact that they're succeeding on the platform. I just think that may turn people off. That loss of gamer cred may be their undoing.
But isn't that, in some sense, isn't that inevitable? Because if I'm Twitch and I built this massive user base of gamers, and now I want to promote a new content vertical, say IRL, I have to cross-market IRL to my existing gamer base, or else I'm not getting any strategic advantage from being large in the gamer population. So to some sense, Twitch has every incentive, as they try to move mainstream and broaden their content, to start forcing you as a gamer to see less gaming related content. You know, I mean, again, just another factor that's pulling away from this single entity market dominance.
Last question about this topic before we wind down. What about just even traditional, like how far off are we from seeing sitcoms and sports games and unscripted content on these platforms?
I think the NFL.
Yeah, NFL and Amazon, that's the thing right now.
Twitch,
yeah,
right?
Julia Child, I think it might even have been exclusive, the Julia Child cooking shows for Twitch.
I think that's an inevitability. Yeah. But to me, that scares me if I'm Twitch a little bit. The growth will be there short term. The question is long term, does that hurt you? Does that hurt you? Now, if their ambition is to be the streaming platform for everything and everybody, maybe not. But if this is truly about streaming games and about the games, in the long term, it may hurt them.
That'll wrap things up for our first podcast here. This was fun. This was a lot of fun, I have to say. This was a good conversation. You guys know your stuff. That's good. It's good when starting a podcast to have people that know their stuff.
I'm impressed how much Paul and I agreed and simultaneously disagreed.
We can't do that for the next one.
Yeah,
we gotta have more.
We're gonna find more topics where you guys clash for sure. This has been the Business of Esports podcast. Before we get out, where can people find you on social media, guys?
You can find me at William_Collis on Twitter, and that's the best way to hit me up.
Go to thebusinessofelsports.com.
All right, that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Business of Esports podcast. Check us out at thebusinessofelsports.com and on Twitter at BizEsports.